Welcome to the Marines Memorial for this very unique event. You know, the Marines Memorial honors the legacy of military service. And for that, I have to ask you, because we're talking about Vietnam wars and salute the Vietnam veterans. Would all the Vietnam veterans stand up, please? Joe Galloway, a world-class combat correspondent, and advised Len on this filmmaking. Phil Goya is a Vietnam veteran, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and he's going to moderate the discussion after it's over. Len Novak is a filmmaker of extraordinary. She's been in filmmaking for a number of years. She's well known. She's made such things as jazz, baseball, and things for PBS, including the one called The War. It was about a 9-sequence film. This film, the Vietnam War, she partnered with Ken Burns to make it. And I tell you, it's going to be something else. Please help me welcome Len Novak up here on the stage.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here tonight. I do have a few thank yous, and I will try to keep my remarks fairly short because what we really want to do is share the film with you and then have a conversation, and that will be much more interesting than me trying to tell you what you're about to see. But we definitely would like to thank the Marines Memorial for having us here tonight to celebrate this extraordinary occasion. It's really a tremendous honor. Thank you. I also want to thank Joe Galloway and Phil Goya for participating in our film and for helping us understand this extremely complicated story and for sharing the stage with me tonight to help us explain to all of you what we've tried to do and shed some light on it. There are also a number of other people here tonight who have participated in the film as well. Many people who have been interviewed and their families, as well as our narrator, Peter Coyote. And I don't want to name everybody, but please let me just say on behalf of Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, our producer, our writer, Jeff Ward, we are enormously grateful for the contributions you have made to this project. This is something that about 10 years ago, Ken and I decided we would try to take on the story of the Vietnam War. We get asked a lot, why did you want to do that? And it's a pretty simple answer. It seems to us that the Vietnam War is one of the most important events in American history since World War II, and one of the most divisive and one of the least well understood. I think we're still asking ourselves what happened and why. And our film is a search for answers to some questions that may never be answered. But it's been an incredible journey for all of us to try to explore this story from as many sides as we possibly could. PBS came up with a tagline after we finished the film, which is, "There is no single truth in war." And I think that was the animating vision for us to try to put our arms around this very painful and divisive story. We talked to people who fought in it. We talked to people who fought against it. We talked to many Vietnamese participants on both the winning and the losing side. And we've come up with a film that is 10 parts, 18 hours. It will be shown, as you were told, on PBS starting September 17th for 10 nights and then repeated once a week. So there will be, we hope, the initiation of a great national conversation about this war and its lasting effects on our society. So what we're going to do tonight is show you about 50 minutes of clips. And you know, if Ken were here, I know he would say, and I would agree with him, that we really hate to show clips because we've put a lot of effort into crafting a 10-part series of 18 hours long. What we'd prefer to do is to shut the door and start running episode 1. And you will be out of here tomorrow at, I don't know, what would that be, like 4 o'clock? Okay, we will just show you some clips. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what you're going to see without really trying to explain too much detail. The first thing we're going to show is the introduction. That hopefully does not need any setup. It speaks for itself. We are then going to drop you into the third episode. It's a scene in which the American soldiers, for the first time, really have a major encounter with North Vietnamese troops. Then we are going to show you a scene from our fourth episode in which you will see a woman who grew up in Hanoi and who has moved to South Vietnam after the country was divided. And her story is paired with the experiences of a Viet Cong guerrilla from the South. Then we're going to drop you into our fifth episode, up along the DMZ, some Marines and a North Vietnamese soldier talking about what it was like at Con Thien in the fall of '67. And then we are going to drop you into our sixth episode, a rather significant chunk from the Tet Offensive, which I'm sure is familiar to many people here. And I just want to say that this particular scene includes some of the most violent and graphic footage that's in the film, and that was filmed during the course of the Vietnam War. And we thought long and hard about whether to share it with you tonight, taking it out of context of the film. But we felt it was important that you, as many of you are veterans, and also your families and just the country, understand what the war was like. That's what we've tried to show in the film. And so this is some tough stuff to watch, but we feel it's important for the conversation we're going to have, and so you can get a sense of how we have tried to put our arms around what this story really was about. We are then going to jump ahead to our ninth episode, and the introduction of the episode kind of sets the table for what the war did in terms of dividing America and how the country was really reacting to this long war that had not ended by 1970. And the last scene hopefully does not need any explanation. It takes place at the end of the ninth episode. So really looking forward to what I think will be a really interesting conversation, and eager to hear what you all think. Okay, thank you.
I don't think there's any of us in this audience who served in Vietnam, who flew or fought or served on the sea, who aren't terribly moved by what we saw here. And I thought it'd be interesting to just ask you, Len, this has been a 10-year effort, a decade, almost as long as the war itself. How did you get started in this, and how did you and Ken decide to embark on this epic journey?
We took a big, deep breath before we decided that we would dare to take on this enormously complicated and tragic and painful and difficult story. And I think we felt that it would be a huge challenge, but if we could get our arms around it and really try to see it from as many perspectives as possible and honor the people who served in it and hear what they had to say about what it was like for them and their families, and to not just make the mistake that I think many Americans make in thinking about the Vietnam War, which is to think about ourselves, but to really extend our curiosity into what was this like for Vietnamese on all sides. We could maybe shed some new light on this story. It felt to us that this is sort of unfinished business for our country, sort of a festering wound that just keeps on just boiling away, and that the only way we would know to try to address that is to just really ask these simple questions. What happened? What was it like? Why? And what does that mean for us today? And it did take us quite a long time to just keep peeling back the layers of the onion. We talked to hundreds and hundreds of people to pick the 80 that appear on screen among yourselves and a number of other people here. And I think through their sort of courage, your courage and honesty and humility, we feel like we've got some new insights into this story.
To that point, it's interesting that, and I'm sure there's many of us who've never seen the face of our erstwhile enemy as we saw it on the screen. I know I hadn't before I saw these rushes. I've never had an opportunity to actually speak to a soldier that I fought against. I know that in the clip, the piece from Hue that's being held back, there's some information there that I was stunned when I saw it. And I'm wondering, when you went to Vietnam, the government gave you carte blanche to go up and down the country and speak to anyone. There was no restriction on who you could interview on either side?
No, and I will say we were really greatly inspired by the incredible work that Joe and Hal Moore did in going back to Vietnam to get to know the former enemies that you faced then. And the wonderful books you've written about that really helped us to think that it would be possible to do. You did that many, many years ago, and opened up a whole wave, I think, of people doing that. But I'd be curious to hear what Joe thinks, his experience too. But we had several meetings with officials from the Vietnamese government in the U.S. and explained to them that what we really wanted to do was to try to tell the human story of the war from the ordinary people who lived through it. And I remember vividly the ambassador saying to us, well, we Vietnamese don't normally think about the war that way. It's sort of this, grand political narrative. But if you can find that out, we'd like to hear what you find out too. And so, what can we do to help you? And we want Americans to know what the war was like for us, and we want to know what it was like for you. We don't know that either. And so we just chipped away with contacts we had there, and one person led to another, and some people we talked to had actually written books in Vietnamese that had been translated, and we got better at it as we met more people and just learned what questions to ask. And it was revelatory every day. It was a revelation there, really.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
I remember, I grew up an Army brat. I remember my father was teaching at West Point in the 50s, and he came home one evening in 1954 and put the New York Times on the dining table and said the French had lost this big battle in Indochina, which was the first war, the Indochina War. And I'm sorry my father never lived to see me be commissioned and fight in Vietnam, but he said something that evening that I thought was really prescient. He said, I'll bet we get sucked into this somehow.
54, he said that.
Boy, was he right. And of course, Joe's experience was, Joe, I've never been back to Vietnam. You went back with General Moore and Sergeant Major Plumley and all those that you fought with, Jack Smith, who was a good friend of both of ours. What was it like going back and meeting your counterparts and walking over the same battlefield that you had? By the way, Joe is the only correspondent in the Vietnam War to be awarded the Bronze Star by the United States Army for heroism.
It was, we went back, I think, to General and I 4 or 5 times. And it was really hard to break the doors down to get in the first time. But we got in, and we got enough interviews that we could proceed with the book. And the book gets published. But before the book, there was a cover story for U.S. News that I wrote, and based on that trip to Hanoi. And before we could finish the first book, we got a cable from Hanoi saying, if you'll come back, we'll give you the people you were asking for last time. And so we were getting close to finishing the book, and we said, okay, we'll gamble on it. We'll take 2 weeks off, and we went to Hanoi, and there we met. The first time they gave us General Giap, and they gave us General Hoang Phong, the historian, who were both quite valuable, but they weren't the people who fought against us. So the second trip, we got the whole 9 yards. They put us up in a guest house in the compound of their Pentagon, their defense ministry, and it was just bizarre. We didn't know going over how would we be received in the capital of our enemy, and it turned out we were received rather openly. And each trip, each interview, they became a little more open, a little more honest about the story we were trying to get out of them. And finally, after the book was done, and we pressed them every trip to try to get back to the battlefield. And we came back that third time with 10 of our veterans, and they had promised us that they would let us go back to the battlefield. But we're in Hanoi, and we go to a dinner at the floating restaurant on the West Lake. And there's at one table are these 3 generals and Hal Moore and myself. And General Phong was speaking for them. And he said, we like your book. And I'm just stunned. He said, we liked your book. You said that our soldiers fought bravely and honorably, and we love our soldiers as much as you love yours. And so it was just like daylight came from that point on. Now,
I understand, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you actually flew out to the battlefield in a Russian helicopter.
Yeah.
And the deal was you were not allowed to spend the night there. You were going to be backhauled that evening.
We were all supposed to be back before dark.
And General Moore...
He arranged with God that it would be otherwise.
I think the weather helped.
And General Moore, by the way, General Moore, when I was a boy, was Major Moore, who lived up the street from us, you know, and he was a great guy. He cut some kind of deal with the clerk of the weather, didn't he? And there was some kind of monsoon rain that just deluged the battlefield so that helicopter could not come back and get you, and you spent the night.
First, it was 2 lifts. It had to be 2 lifts, and we put all the Vietnamese and most of the Americans on the first lift out. And Hal was arranging all of this stuff. Yeah. And then as soon as that thing lifted off, he said, Joe, you need to tell the boys, there were, I think, 5 of us left there, plus a film crew. He said, tell the boys to fill up the water bottles in the creek. And I looked at him, I said, sir. He said, don't ask, just pass my orders. And I went along and told the boys, I said, the old man says, get the canteens down to the creek and fill them up, and don't forget the iodine pills. Right. And Larry Gwynn, Lieutenant Larry Gwynn, he looked at me, he said, Joe, has the heat got to the old man? I said, I'm playing Sergeant Major now, just do what you're told. And then I go back and Hal says, you need to get the boys to drag up some firewood. And I still ain't figured this out, but there's a big dark cloud on the horizon and a monsoon rain came. Hal Moore had told me 15 years before that we were going to spend the night on that battlefield someday. He needed that. He needed to walk those perimeter of those old foxholes and commune with the souls of every man who died there, friend and enemy. And he arranged that with God. I'm just as confident of that as anything, because there came a monsoon rain, and after it lifted, we built a little fire with the firewood, and we were sure that chopper was not coming back because they couldn't find it in the daylight. We had to, we used Hal Moore's old battle map and my Boy Scout compass, and Bruce Crandall guided that helicopter to the LZ. So we spent the night there, and as it got good dark, there was an absolute, the most beautiful shower of meteors I have ever seen. The sky was full of tracers. And I had a feeling, and I think all of us did, that the souls of all those who fell there were telling us they were at peace, and so should we be.
Yes, I agree. I think the clip... I think the piece that Len and Ken had put together there on the Battle of the Ia Drang that showed your fight indicated how fierce it was. It was, as the enemy commander indicated, their job was to come in and grab us by the belt buckle, because if they stayed outside arm's length, we would pound them with artillery and air and everything else we had. And to the point of this documentary, I had a lot of respect for our adversaries. I never hated the enemy. I was a professional soldier. And I actually got in trouble once. I think I told Len about this. I half-jokingly commented to one of my battalion commanders in the 1st Cavalry Division, how much are we spending on each of these people that we're killing here, the enemy soldiers? And he said, I have no idea. He made Major General later, so he wasn't that dumb. But I said, sir, you know, wouldn't it make just more sense if we just hired these guys to work for us? And he said, what are you talking about? We have a South Vietnamese. I said, not them. I'm talking about the North Vietnamese. These guys come in against us we've got armor, we've got artillery, we've got napalm, we've got airstrikes, and they still come in at us.
Here they
I said,
come.
the British hired the Gurkhas. Why can't we do this with a... And he said, Phil, you're never going to be a general officer with that kind of attitude.
Well, he was right.
He was right. So Len, another comment here. I know Ken can't be here tonight, but what would Ken say if he could be here with you tonight to talk to us about what an achievement this has been in a signal episode in the history of the United States?
We've been out on the road quite a bit talking about why we made the film, and so I think we found it very humbling to try to tackle this subject, and every day has been a revelation. And I think Ken and Jeff Ward, our writer, and Sarah Botson, our producer, and I have each come to this from a different vantage point. We're 10 years apart in age. We figured out after the fact. So Jeff is in his 70s, Ken is in his 60s, I'm in my 50s, and Sarah's in her 40s. And each of us thought we knew something about this subject, depending on our age and our perspective. And it turns out that every day we realize what we didn't know, either about the many different ways this war affected the Vietnamese, or the strategy that was being decided in Washington, Hanoi, and Saigon, or what it was like for the soldiers and Marines that we sent over to Vietnam to fight, or what it was actually like on the home front. Just day after day after day, there were things we didn't know that we thought we knew.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of been overwhelming, frankly. I mean, if you could see in our office the just groaning bookshelves of books. I mean, it's an overwhelming story, and the complexity of it, and the sort of emotional, intellectual challenges of what we tried to do was just humbling. And I think, as we tried to sort of work our way through this piece by piece, we would have moments of feeling it was such a dark story and such a tragedy. It was hard to find redemption, meaning, something to hold on to. And what we ended up coming away with in the end was gratitude for the people who shared their stories with us, and a deep understanding that sort of as part of the human condition, we all face tragedy, and what we have is the ability to tell a story about it and to make sense of it and create a narrative. And the brilliance and sort of honesty of everyone who shared their stories with us, that's the redemption that we've been able to find in this very difficult story.
I believe this will be a go-to film. This will be one of the hallmark references for the war in Vietnam. And it's kind of sad that it comes at such a date that, and this is a statistic verified by the VA just yesterday, that 2/3 of us who fought or served in the war in Vietnam have already passed on. So there's only 33% of us that served in that war that are alive today. I wish that more of them could have seen this, and somehow I feel that they will see it. But it's been a great effort, and we're very grateful to you for having done what you've done.
Well, thank you. I mean, we really have been driven to a large degree with an urgency of trying to tell the story now, because in spite of those horrible statistics, unlike the attempt we made to tell the story of the Second World War at a time when most of the veterans were in their really late 70s into 90s, your generation is much more vital and vibrant and remembers this vividly, and there's a lot of people around who can tell us what it was really like.
Yeah,
so we felt we had to try to tell this story now, and we also felt it was important for our country to hear from the men and women who served in Vietnam what it was like, and that we have a chance to honor your service and thank you and say welcome home, which we never really did properly, and it's not too late for that. So that was important. This war tore the country apart because it was unclear after a certain point what we were fighting for, and whether we could win, and whether it was worth it. And these are profound questions. And there are many people who felt they were equally patriotic, who felt the war was wrong and wanted to try to find a way to make it stop. And so we've tried to tell that story and honor those experiences as well, which makes it a very, very complicated story to tell.
Well, I was particularly taken by Neil Sheehan's comment that we saw here. Neil Sheehan's a correspondent who was in the very early days of 61, 62, 63. He was there with David Halberstam and you, Joe, the early days, the guys that were in there very early on, when they all believed in the mission. They believed in what we were doing, Joe. We all believed in what we were doing.
Well, they were sort of 62, 63, right. 64. I came in 65 with the first Marines that came in. And David Halberstam, who I really became very close friends with, said, you know, he was the son of an Army doctor, right. and grew up on Army bases, and he said, we all believed in that war. We thought it was the right thing. We were going to defeat monolithic communism, and as the months and the years went on, it became less clear to them as what our purpose was and what the outcome was likely to be. And of course, their point was, their deciding moment was at the Battle of Bach.
That's right.
And by then they were, you know, the embassy line that the Vietnamese were going to win this war was clearly not so. And they began moving toward the idea it was going to take American troops.
Yeah.
And
Can I ask Joe? I'm curious, you've covered many wars. So
too many.
Yes, and it seems to be the human condition that we find ourselves continually at war. But what was it like covering the Vietnam War for you in the early days when you first got there, compared to the later wars that you've, you know, because the way the press, the access you had, and the ability to go where you wanted, and no one was telling you what to write about?
Vietnam was the most openly, freely covered war in the history of our country. No censorship. You know, you pitched up in Saigon and you had a letter from an editor somewhere, or a job with a news agency or something, and you went down to the MACV press office and you got your press pass. And all you had to do was sign a one-page piece of paper about 5 simple OPSEC rules, operational security. I will not report troop movements while they're underway. I will not report the actual number of friendly casualties in a battle that's still being fought. It's very simple stuff. And then with that press pass, you could get on any American plane. You could go and spend time with any American unit, and nobody's going to complain about your stories until much later.
I'll bet. Yeah.
And, you know, for me, I was a kid. I was 23 years old. I was the age of the lieutenants. And I went to school on that war. I learned things. One thing I learned was you want to be very damn careful with the truth. You want to spell the names of people's hometowns correctly and get the state right, too. And the reason is, and I would tell this at journalism schools from time to time, is that, you know, I would go out and I might stay 3 hours, I might stay 3 days with a unit, a company of Marines, a company of Army, and take my pictures, write my story, get it sent. What I was sure of is that I would probably see those guys again somewhere down the road. And I was also pretty sure my story would appear in Stars and Stripes, and it would make its way slowly to that company, or their mama back home would cut it out of the Kankakee Register Guard and mail it in her next letter. And I was going to see him again, and I didn't want to screw that story up about men who were armed and dangerous.
That's right.
It made me a very careful reporter. But the wars, you know, the technology is what changed drastically. would take me, once I got out of the battlefield and found a Army phone somewhere that I could get on, it would take sometimes 6, 8, 10 hours to dictate 400 words to my office in Saigon. I would have to find somebody willing to carry my bag of film to Saigon and actually hand it over to my people at the airport. It was a very slow and tedious process, and I learned many new curse words. You know, there were 4 categories. You were category 1, 2, or 3. Your call went through pretty good. If you were a civilian reporter, you were category 4, until you learned that you could say, "This is Colonel Galloway, category 2." You know, and I look at, we sent people into the invasion of Iraq with not 1, but 2 satellite phones, 1 in each pocket, in case this one broke. They could send pictures, they could, hell, I even sent a sketch artist to combat in Iraq, on the invasion of Iraq. And the guy takes along a little tiny scanner, and he would do his drawings and scan them and send them on the satellite, and they were in the paper the next day. Damned amazing.
It was a different,
Well, I will just at least say one more thing about covering the Vietnam War. It was extraordinarily dangerous, and I think 200 reporters and journalists and cinematographers were killed over the course of the war, American and Vietnamese, and from other countries as well. And you know, we owe a debt, whatever we may think about the media and the way the war is covered. If they weren't there, we wouldn't have the ability to make this film or to, you know, try to put our arms around this story.
Sure.
So.
Willing to give your life for the truth.
Joe, you'll resonate with this. I remember I was a company commander in the Cav. We were up on the 3 Corps border, Cambodia. I got a call from battalion saying, "There's this idiot reporter who wants to come out," you know, and I said, "Hey, you know, he can come out, but I can't guarantee him a backhaul." I said, "If we hit contact, I'm going to take in, you know, rations, water, backhaul my wounded." And he was on the next bird, and he landed in our LZ, and we got in a little contact, and we kept him with us for a couple days. He got to know us pretty well, you know, more than he probably thought he would, and then we got him out when we could. But I had to say, in every instance that I knew, not one of the people who were assigned to cover the war ever shirked from going out to find it. And it was, as you say, it was an amazing experience. My hat's off to the guys like you.
Well, there were approximately 500 accredited correspondents carrying that American press card around. But during my time in the field, I saw the same 15 or 20 people on every operation and every battle. There were those of us who saw that as, I came there to cover the war. I came there to tell the story of soldiers and Marines. And the only damn way you can do that is to get out there with them in the rice paddies and in the jungle and do it. And there were a lot of folks who took day trips. The press office in Saigon would arrange day trips. If you saw the movie We Were Soldiers, they have that Chinook landing and 20 or 30 of these guys popping out of the back. That's absolutely true. I saw it with my own eyes, and it really pissed me off. Because I'd been there for 3 days and I had a lot of bullets shot at me, and these guys fly in, they stay 30 minutes and they fly out, and they're guaranteed to be back in Saigon before dark.
I got it.
There's a scene in the film after that we showed the part of the Tet Offensive, but we didn't continue the scene where we go into the city of Hue, which was decimated and where the fighting was the worst and lasted the longest. And maybe you would tell the story of what you saw when you got there. So I think our audience would be interested.
Well, there's a piece that's not shown tonight, and it's been, I wouldn't use the term embargoed, I think it's just been held back until September. And the reason is there's a couple of interviews that are both bookended to this, An incident that happened during the siege of Hue, during the Tet Offensive in '68. Now, I was in the 82nd Airborne as a second lieutenant. We had deployed from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, as a response to General Westmoreland's call for more troops in the middle of the Tet Offensive. We had been down in Florida on a night jump, and we were pulled back to Bragg, loaded onto C-141s, and flown to Vietnam. I was a second lieutenant, no combat experience. Most of my platoon had been in Vietnam in the 1st Cavalry Division, 101st Airborne, 173rd. They were experienced combat soldiers, but I was a second lieutenant, brand new. We were in the fight for Hue, not downtown where the Marines were fighting to retake the Citadel. That was ferocious fighting, but we were operating along the grossly misnamed Perfume River, which runs south of Hue toward the sea. And moving village to village along the banks of the river, looking for North Vietnamese VC and arms caches and weapons and things like that. Now this is after the fighting had died down a little bit in the city, and I remember one afternoon this is early March. It had rained. Remember up in I Corps, this is up north. It rained constantly during the fight for Hue. It rained, and it was so cold up there. I couldn't believe how cold it was at night. And this is only midway up Vietnam, which is about the size of the state of California. And I was thinking that if it's this cold where we are, these guys up in Hanoi must be freezing their asses off. They were 400 miles further north. And I was thinking, if I were up in North Vietnam and it's that cold, I'd be fighting to get down south. But you know, we had moved along the banks of the Perfume, and we had just cleared one of these big imperial tombs. This is where the Vietnamese had buried their emperors in the old days, and this tomb was like something out of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Lost Horizons. It had Buddhist monks, monkeys in the upper things of the tomb, and I didn't speak Vietnamese. I spoke a bit of French, and I could speak to the monks in French, and they could speak to me in French. It was really bad French. And I asked them if they'd seen any enemy, and no enemy here. And we moved along about 400 or 500 meters away, and we got a whiff of something that was really dead. I had a sergeant named Ruben Torres from New Mexico, shortest paratrooper in my outfit. We had to load him down with extra equipment when we did a jump because he just drifted right off the drop zone. But he was a sharp NCO, E5, and he comes over to me and he says, "Sir, there's something more than just sheep or whatever out here." He said, "I saw this bone in the ground, and it looked like an animal, but it turned out to be the elbow of a woman who had been buried there for some time." And we started to dig this up, and it was a trench that went on for about 100 yards, and in that trench were over 150 men, women, and children and babies that had been killed by the North Vietnamese, the VC, and buried there. They'd been executed, all of them had had their hands tied behind their back, and they'd been shot. And most of them had been shot, some had not. And I was only hoping that the ones that had been buried had been dead before they were shoveled over. But they'd been in the ground for some time. Now, this was one of the massacres that had occurred when the North Vietnamese and VC had invested Hue. They had lists prepared of the people. You saw a reference to it here, the murder squads, the killing, assassination squads that went in. Now, I understand that, I was an Eagle Scout, and this is my first confrontation with what communism and what the enemy could do. And it was a shock. We got a lot of flack for that. I actually gave sworn testimony to the Army in the 70s about that incident, because they wanted to go back and verify that what we had seen, which was only one of the graves that were later discovered, was authentic. And there were certain American academics, Mr. Chomsky at MIT, who maintained this was all up front and it was a South Vietnamese American trick. But Len's people going to Vietnam unearthed some pretty amazing stuff, and it shows up in this piece that you'll see, but that's what that was all about.
Well, yeah, we some of the witnesses on the other side were quite honest about what happened, and that was surprising to us. And it does speak to the importance of bearing witness, as you just have done for us today. Yeah. It's, to tell us what you saw and what that was like. It's really unimaginable. And you are correct. I think on the left, there are many books, and one of the things that was challenging for us was that this is contested history. It's not settled. It's still being sorted out. New materials are coming to light. New scholarship is being done. New documents are being declassified here and in Vietnam. And so if you were to pick up a book from the 70s, American historians might have written that it was American artillery that had caused the deaths of civilians at Hue, which I'm sure, in fact, many civilians were killed by American artillery trying to take the city back, but not what you saw. So.
No, it was.
No, there were 3,000, I think,
Yeah, 3,000.
executed in the streets and area of Hue.
The sad part was ours was just a small grave. I mean, they found much bigger ones later, but we were one of the first. And by the way, you know, I gave that BBC interview, the radio interview, and there's one thing that had occurred to me in the middle of that interview was that every army is capable of doing this. I mean, and the irony was, within 14 days of the date that we discovered that grave at Hue, American soldiers at My Lai committed that massacre. And we didn't know about that for another year or so.
It took over a year before the details leaked
absolutely.
out.
Yeah, so this happens, and wars are terrible things, terrible things.
Yeah, I think one of the, it's not really a lesson, or it's maybe an insight that probably is extremely obvious to anyone here who's been in wars, that there's humanity on both sides, or all sides, and inhumanity on all sides. And several times in the film, we have veterans saying to us, you know, we would do well to appreciate our own humanity, the humanity of our enemy and our own inhumanity, because maybe we would do better at not getting into more wars if we appreciated that as just a human condition.
I think that's a good lesson.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Y'all ready for a drink?
Have we had enough? Yeah? Okay. Thank you.